So thank you for the team for having me. And this has just been a wonderful last few days. I've really enjoyed all the papers and all the discussion. So I'm interested in craftspeople, their different types of embodied knowledge and skill, the broader social networks that they were embedded in within their communities, and how innovations can arise and spread throughout very different geographic regions. So my topic today is a small part of a larger project that I'm working on that's looking at the role of craftspeople in the development of an East Mediterranean exchange system during the late third and early second millennium. And one of the things that I've been looking at specifically is the spread of certain motifs on glyptic, trying to contextualize them alongside shared craft practices. And as I've been conducting this research, I couldn't help but see somewhat of a correlation between the spread of certain motifs and practices alongside the development of emergent writing systems in places like Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean. And when it comes to understanding origins, the traditional scholarship has always looked at the graphic aspects of these scripts and compared them to the Egyptian scripts, which from my perspective kind of glosses over a whole corpus of evidence that has been ignored, which we can find in craft communities. So my goal today is to try to complicate the picture by bringing in some additional data and looking at the potential graphic interconnections actually across these different scripts to diversify the possible factors that was impacting on their design. To think about writing as, we've been talking about writing as visual experience, but I want to kind of shift our perspective a little bit and think about writing as a reflection of visual experience. Now, a disclaimer, this is just ongoing research, and so I'm not presenting the results of some sort of systematic investigation, which is nowhere near complete. But rather what I want to do is kind of raise some new questions about how visual encounters between people in specific contexts may have impacted on the design of scripts in the East Mediterranean during this period. And I also want to make it very clear that by highlighting graphic connectivity or similarity, in no way, shape, or form am I claiming that these writing systems shared similar features or that such graphic features meant that signs were interpreted in the same way. So just to clarify, get that out of the way. So to set the stage, prior to about 2000 BCE, the only scripts that were in use in the Mediterranean were the Egyptian scripts and cuneiform, which are both graphically and materially very different. Yet as we see the intensification of exchange around metal, textiles, semi-precious stones, ivory, oils, and so on, let's say just kind of around 2000, something interesting happens, and that's after several hundred years of only these scripts in use, we all of a sudden see several new writing systems emerge within the first quarter, let's say 250 years or so of the second millennium. So in Egypt and Sinai, early alphabetic inscriptions appear. In the Nile Valley on metalworking tools and weaving tools, personal objects also found in the southern Levant. We see what's been called a pseudo-hieroglyphic script that appears overwhelmingly on stamp seals, but also cylinder seals in the northern Levant. Moving north, we heard from Philip earlier about this pseudo-hieroglyphic script that appears written on metal and stone at Byblos, which is paleographically, there's a range in terms of when it's been dated. One of these datings has placed it as early as the late third, early second millennium, so I include it here, and this will be a case study that we'll look at and kind of complicate the picture a little bit. And then on Crete, as we heard from Sarah, we see the so-called Archanes script or formula, and Cretan hieroglyphs appear predominantly on stamp seals, but also clay, and then several generations later, we have Linear A. Now, as I said, these have all, for the most part, except for Linear A, been compared to the Egyptian scripts based on graphic similarity, which has resulted in questions about the nature of Egyptian influence within each of these regions, and also models that are largely described as kind of imitative or borrowing. And as I said, I kind of want to move in a different direction by looking at how other forms of visual communication may have impacted on these scripts designs, giving insight into the nature of social interaction, and take more of an interregional approach by exploring the possible paleographic similarities across scripts. Now, to do this, we're going to hop in our imaginary boat and take a dangerous journey around the Mediterranean by crossing regional and disciplinary boundaries to look at three case studies, which are the Aegean scripts, the Byblos script, and these pseudo-hieroglyphs from the southern Levant. So to get us started, I want to think about what goes into the design of a script. And I want to highlight a recent paper by a colleague and a dear friend of mine, Alice Mandel, who developed what she calls the craft literacy approach to early alphabetic inscriptions, but which is very useful for my work as well. Now, I really like this paper because what Alice does is she kind of plays around this idea about craft literacy as being something less than scribal literacy, and points out that for the early alphabet, most inscriptions were actually on crafted objects. So she asks us to look more critically at these objects as inscribed objects, as reflections of various types of knowledge, or what she refers to as literacy. So thinking about kind of the embodied knowledge of the person who made the object, it's knowledge of the tools, it's how to work certain materials, it's the overall design, it's the act of making the inscription, but it's also how the inscription would have functioned, it's the signs, how they would have looked. Now, when it comes to sign making, in their foundational book, Reading Images, The Grammar of Visual Design, Kress and Van Leeuwen remind us that sign making is part of a complex process of representation that arises, quote, out of the cultural, social, and psychological history of the sign maker, and framed and focused by the specific environment in which the sign maker produces that sign, end quote. Meaning, in order to understand the representation, we need to think about the person making the sign, their situatedness, their knowledge, their social interactions. And if we see graphic similarity across scripts, we need to ask what made the shape or form of these signs successful from a design perspective, so to speak, to be incorporated locally across diverse communities. Where were text makers seeing these signs? And we can't really explore these questions without a consideration of who the sign maker was in society, and the social and material worlds in which these signs were designed. So to better understand the choices made in a script's design, I employ Etienne Weger's community of practice framework, which maintains that such a community exists wherever a group of people sustain engagement around a shared domain, resulting in a shared repertoire of practices, symbols, artifacts, and so on, kind of linked to a very context-specific group identity that kind of allows us to overcome these larger monolithic cultural labels, and to look a little more critically at what these joint endeavors were, right? Why are people coming together around these shared domains? Now, markers of participation can include things like beliefs about how to do or make something, like how a seal should look, how it should be used, or as shown here, how to participate in exchange. This can also be formed as a valid shared domain. And key to a community of practice is the diversity of its members, who often can come from different ethnic, religious, and linguistic backgrounds, but also represent different levels of participation. So newcomers versus old-timers. Now, as new members enter the group, what constitutes this shared repertoire is constantly being renegotiated, which can create space for innovation. So to employ an approach like this means to focus on the domain in which around people were coming together, resulting in shared practices that were marking membership in a community. So it's not just to focus on the script, but also to think about the larger community and the associated practices that would have resulted from it. Now, in thinking about craft communities and writing, Seth Sanders pointed out on this axe mold here that he looked at kind of the role of craftspeople as conduits through which the early alphabet may have been disseminated by pointing out that this mold found in the southern Levant is inscribed with Ugaritic cuneiform. Quoting, it connects the craft of scribe and metalworker and suggests writing was distributed through travel, the communication of mobile craftsmen, end quote. So what do we know about craftspeople in the early second millennium? Well, contemporary with the rise of new scripts, various texts give us insight into the range of knowledge and social roles of skilled labor. So from the private archives of merchants at the site at Kultepe-Konesh in central Anatolia, who dealt extensively in metal and textile trade, we know of individuals like Huzur Ana, who was a first-generation metalsmith and merchant to the site, so he had immigrant parents, and he knew how to write. Archaeologically, Oya Topshwalu has shown that in metal workshops at this site, there's unfinished stamp seals and cylinder seals, suggesting that glyptic was made in mixed media workshops, while texts reveal that seal carvers could have also served as witnesses in legal transactions in lieu of scribes. From the palace at Mari on the Euphrates, texts attest to high levels of mobility of all sorts of skilled labor, as well as to non-local craftspeople staying together, raising questions about the exchange of practices, ideas, and visual modes of communication. And then in Egypt, we have the famous Stele of Irtisen, overseer of craftspeople who boasts he can work in a range of materials, he knew hieroglyphs, highlighting the need to think about kind of the different embodied knowledge sets that people possess. Now, these are by no means representative of everybody, but it kind of gives us little windows into which we can look. Now, considering the data for material crossovers, a cross-craft approach asks that we consider how innovations or practices in one industry can affect others. So in thinking about writing as kind of, in many ways, some sort of communicative technological system, I also want to think about how it intersects with different craft industries. So I want to begin with the development of writing on Crete, where, as we heard from Sarah already, around the turn of the second millennium or so, we have the Archanes formula on seals, followed by Cretan hieroglyphic engraved on seals, but also in clay. And for over a century, polarizing debate has centered on kind of the degree to which Egyptian writing influenced writing on the island, resulting in a pendulum of sorts swinging back and forth between external influence and local innovation. So on the left, you can see some of the graphic similarities pointed out over a century ago by Evans. In the center, imported Egyptian scarabs to the island, which have played a role in this debate. And on the right, an excellent recent paper by Silvia Ferrara, Barbara Montecchi, and Miguel Valerio, who sought to kind of critically test this proposal by developing a methodology that combines archaeology, paleography, iconography, and material culture for cross-comparison. Now, their method advocates for investigating all variations of a Cretan hieroglyphic sign systematically, and then comparing those variants to their supposed counterparts in the Egyptian script, as well as to looking at local material culture on the island, as well as iconography, to see whether or not it could have been a local innovation. Now, to illustrate their method, one of the case studies that they looked at was the bead, which forms part of the royal titulary in Egypt. After compiling all variants, which are not shown here, I just selected two, they highlight graphic variation in the Cretan bees. So they're kind of wonky looking. They got fewer legs than the Egyptian sign. They're flying in different directions. So if they're copying, why are they doing such a bad job? Now, they aptly point out that when you look at the earliest attestation of this sign in the late 3rd millennium, it's actually wasp-like, and thus it's not even like the Egyptian glyph. So they conclude that the sign must have come from local depictions of fauna on the island. Now, they're the first to really provide a methodology of its kind for cross-cultural comparisons of scripts, and it makes sense for their question regarding the impact of the Egyptian script on local writing practices. And it's actually been really influential on me to kind of provide a blueprint for my own work. However, I wonder how this view changes when we think about iconography and the material record in Egypt. And not just the script. Is it possible that interregional interaction still played a role on the development of certain signs? And if so, what kind? So when we look to stamp seal amulets in contemporary contexts on Crete, we actually find kind of these same wonky looking bees and even the same arrangement. Now, this is a corpus that has long been contentious in debates on the nature of interaction, but I think it deserves a second look. Indeed, we see motifs that later become signs in the Cretan hieroglyphic script that appear on stamp seal amulets by the late 3rd millennium. And here are just a few, including the double axe motif, which appears on Cretan seals associated with the Archanes formula. Similar depictions of the hand sign on seals with the Archanes formula are known to look very similar to carnelian hand amulets with kind of the thumb sticking out that are found in late 3rd millennium contexts in Egypt. And notably, you can see this little seal here, over here, has this little guy with his hand raised and his backhand down, which is very similar to the seals on Crete. Graphically similar to the sign that becomes Cretan hieroglyphic sign 1. Now, if we were to only compare the Cretan material with the Egyptian script, we miss these important parallels. So what do we actually know about the nature of contact between communities? Now, the possibility that seal producers from Crete were in close and continuous contact with individuals in Egypt during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium was proposed by Judith Weingarten based on the appearance of animals not native to Crete being carved in contemporary glyptic on the island, as well as in Egypt. Additionally, the use of hippopotamus ivory thought to have been imported from Egypt to Crete was used almost exclusively to carve the so-called parading lion seal group around say like 2100 BCE or so, which is defined by animals, most often lions, arranged around the circumference of the seal. In Egypt, lion amulets and the appearance of similarly designed seals used in local administrative sealings led Weingarten to propose economic cooperation with Egypt, led to the transformation of the lion as maybe a local symbol of power on Crete. And Emily Anderson has proposed that this group, it's in the center on the top, that this group of seals was maybe used by emergent elites connected to the textile industry. Which I like. Lastly, she proposed that Weingarten proposed that the import and subsequent local manufacture of early Middle Kingdom scarabs on the island attests maybe to the sharing of production knowledge and the similar cultural significance of the seal form, which was used as a funerary amulet. Now, we can actually add further evidence to Weingarten's proposal about producers in contact by drawing on some important observations made by Roland de Court, one of Cambridge's own, who in his unpublished dissertation isolated about 10 motifs that continue to appear on glyptic from Crete over the span of several hundred years, attesting to the intergenerational continuity practice. He connected them to a previously known glyptic koine in the Balkans, Aegean, and Anatolia during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. And notably, he highlights that these motifs also appear in Egyptian stamp seals, suggesting a shared visual language was starting to crystallize between Crete and Egypt during the late 3rd millennium. But he didn't really investigate its significance. Now, notably, the shapes of stamp seal amulets appear to have evolved alongside one another in Egypt and Crete, but in Egypt, they're made mostly out of bright green, blue, and black glazed fired steatite or faience, whereas in Crete, they're carved in ivory and bone. But when taken together, the development of amulet forms and motifs alongside one another in two very different regions during the late 3rd millennium is noteworthy, especially when we consider that the last 3 seals on the far right are forms that will be utilized for writing on Crete. Now, when trying to understand the glyptic koine pointed out by de Court, I started to look for parallels and noticed that many of the motifs appear on textile tools like spindle whorls and stamped loom weights in the East Mediterranean. Fritz Glockelmar has actually pointed out that textile patterns on seals, that these patterns on seals appear very similar to later depictions of textile patterns on Lake Minoan frescoes, kind of raising this question whether, to me at least, raising this question whether this glyptic koine may have resulted in the development of some sort of trans-regional community of practice that was centered around the production and exchange of textiles. Indeed, in looking at the materiality of the Cretan hieroglyphic script, Marie-Louise Nash and Agata Ulanowska have proposed that several signs appear connected to textile production, including the loom, work-weighted loom, the spider as a symbol of spinning, flax, symbols for cloth, different tools, raising the possibility that textile production and exchange may have been one of the factors impacting on the development of the script. So what is this connection between these seals and the Egyptian data? Well, for over 3 decades, people have hypothesized about Egypt's import of Aegean textiles based on funerary depictions in the tombs of nomarchs in Middle Egypt dated to around, we'll say, like 1850. Notably, the motifs and patterns embedded within this larger mosaic appear on both Aegean and Egyptian stamp seals. Now, these include C and S scrolls, the meander or labyrinth motif, kind of these crosses embedded within a square, the rosette. Recently, Juan Carlos Marina Garcia proposed that maybe the governors in Middle Egypt were actually active agents in an international textile trade during the Middle Kingdom based on these painted sealings. Notably, the same patterns on Aegean seals actually appear on the garments worn by depictions of the so-called A'amu caravan here, who are often portrayed as immigrants associated with the Eastern Desert, so you can actually see the zigzag and meander design. So who are these seals actually buried with? In Egypt, we find them predominantly with non-royal women and children. This was based on a study done by Kylie Kortavik. And some men, but much less frequently. And they appear to concentrate in Middle Egypt, but also in the Western Desert, they're mostly in Middle Egypt, where you actually saw that painting earlier of the textile patterns, and also the Western Desert at the site of Baalat. When we put our seals in conversation with epigraphic data, we learned that non-royal women and also men were given the title Priestess of Hathor. This is based on Robin Gillam's study, in the late Old Kingdom as the royal cult was expanding throughout Egypt as part of kind of the state building process. This is when our glyptic Koine starts, which is really interesting because when we look at the other imagery on seals local in Egypt, we get a lot of motifs that are connected to Hathor cult. And what's interesting is that these titles cluster at sites in Middle Egypt connected to administrative elites, which may have been controlling the region for its arable land where flax was grown, perhaps for textile production. Now, while seals have long played a contentious role in debates about the Graphic influence on Crete, when we consider the evidence for producers in contact, the non-figural Koine, the shared amulet forms, the connection with Hathor, who played a big role in the expedition community, it really becomes hard to say that this corpus played no role in possibly impacting the significance of these forms, especially when we consider that these are just a few of the various motifs and arrangements. So I'm actually going through the entire corpus right now, and on the top you can see Crete, and on the bottom you can see in Egypt. They're really sharing a lot of these same motifs. Notably, you can see the second one here is very thread-like, while at the end, the top, you actually see the bee as well as a sign that has been, I think, interpreted as a loon. On the role of imagery introduced to the island, potentially from Egypt, Judith Weingarten also proposed the introduction of the Egyptian goddess Taweret on Crete, likely took place during Egypt's late Middle Kingdom in the early second millennium, and was the impetus for the local transformation of the genus on Crete, as you see on the top left here. Notably, two of the Cretan hieroglyphic signs are of interest here, the beast with the protruding tongue and this saw-like image. Images of figures with protruding tongues holding saws or like these long knives, are well known on the same ivory wands that may have played a role in the introduction of Taweret onto Crete. And indeed, this imagery is associated with women and children in Egypt, childbirth specifically, and was adopted in the Levant as well on seals. As you can see, the seal with Azor, this is an imported seal. Now, while the appearance of such beasts with protruding tongues on Crete appear in pre-palatial contexts, a 12th dynasty stamp seal of Taweret with her tongue protruding and an angle in front of her mouth appears in a very similar layout as this beast on the Minoan seal here. So you can see the same combination of motifs are being used, reflecting some sort of shared practice across glyptic traditions. And of course, this big knife played a big role. So are we looking at a reflection of practices borrowed from a specific context, specific social community? Maybe as a result of textile exchange. So while in that case study, just to end very briefly, the script itself may not have played a role, we have a whole suite of other practices and visual iconography that may have played some sort of impact through exchange. Now, in the second case study, I want to explore how looking at graphic connections across newly developed scripts can complicate script design by looking at the Byblos scripts connection potentially with the Aegean scripts. So the so-called Byblos script is an undeciphered writing system, as we heard earlier, only known from like 14 inscriptions, and maybe like 100 to 115 signs, depending on the stance of the signs and whether these are separate signs or just stamped differently, all of which lack clear stratigraphic contexts. Now, attempts to date the script's development rely on paleographic parallels with the Egyptian hieroglyphs and hieratic signs, which have led most scholars to accept in late third, early second millennium, maybe going into late Bronze Age date, although just recently an early first millennium date was proposed. Given we lack inscriptions from dated contexts outside of the site, the field is kind of at a bit of standstill regarding ways to nuance this picture. Now, with regard to graphic connections, paleographically, as you can see here, the rows marked with B for Byblos, these are signs in the Byblos script, and then E are signs that have been suggested, not by me, but this is kind of an amalgam of various people proposing parallels in the Egyptian scripts. As well as down here, this bottom row, parallels have also been proposed with the early alphabet, kind of raising questions about the nature of contact and the timeline of its development. However, I would also point out paleographic similarities exist between the Byblos script and the Aegean scripts. So while the paleographic similarity between Cretan hieroglyphs and Linear A was recently studied by Sylvia Ferrara and her colleagues, to my knowledge, there hasn't really been an investigation into graphic connections between the Byblos script and the Aegean scripts. And if someone knows of such a study, let me know. But in teal, you have Cretan hieroglyphic signs. Gray is Linear A, and then red are the Byblos script signs. Now, in some cases, you'll see there's more paleographic similarity between Cretan hieroglyphic and Byblos signs than Linear A. And in other cases, there's more similarity between Linear A signs and the Byblos script signs than actual Cretan hieroglyphic. And you'll note that with some Byblos signs, if you have to kind of rotate the stance, and that graphic similarity becomes much clearer. So I'm not really taking stance into consideration here. Now, within these comparisons, what becomes interesting is that about 75% of the signs used for fraction notations appear as signs in the Byblos script, but in non-numerical contexts. So again, regarding the stance, you'll notice that those highlighted at first don't appear similar, but when rotated are essentially the same sign, bringing these specific signs closer to Linear A and Cretan hieroglyphic. Now, such graphic similarity in signs used for some sort of mathematical notation on Crete begs the question, what is the context of contact between communities? And to complicate this picture, again, I provide another data set to think about. Metoda Pershin just published research last year on applied pot marks from the late 3rd millennium in Egypt, but that are coming from central Levant, so kind of around the region of Byblos. And when I was looking at these signs, I couldn't help but notice that some of the designs of these marks are very similar to script signs. So on the top left, we have Cretan hieroglyphic sign 65, which is carved into hardstone seals. And this is very similar. You can see these two dots that are connected by a vertical line. We also see one mark that's very similar to the notation used for 100 in Linear A, as well as several signs that appear in the Byblos script, and actually on seals from the southern Levant. When taken together, this short survey highlights that in addition to looking at Egyptian scripts, I think we also need to begin looking at the nature of contact between Byblos and the Aegean to begin exploring why some of these signs, almost a third of the Byblos signs, appear graphically similar to the Aegean script signs, including the notations for fractions, where the pot marks might fit in. We also need to think about this. Now, you might be saying, okay, but Philip told us earlier that we have no context for the Byblos script, so this seems methodologically a mess. How do we know when it dates to? And this is going to bring me to my last case study, which is the pseudo-hieroglyphs on scarabs from the southern Levant, which you'll notice actually appear, so these two, for example, on seals from the southern Levant. So let's go back to glyptic. Scarabs were first made locally in the southern Levant around 1800, 1700, depending on what chronology you use. But basically around the time you start seeing the emergence of these new writing systems. Now, Daphna Ben-Tor studied this corpus and demonstrated the earliest local designs were seemingly influenced by Egyptian late Middle Kingdom scarabs, as you can see here, where Canaanite seals are marked with a C, reflecting very similar designs as late Middle Kingdom Egyptian seals marked with an E. Within this larger corpus, Daphna showed how local southern Levantine seal producers incorporated both valid Egyptian hieroglyphs and signs that seemingly imitated Egyptian hieroglyphs. She states, quote, "These signs, which are not attested elsewhere, consist of individual signs as well as groupings of two or more signs. The individual signs include misrendered forms, their random distribution of these signs and the inconsistency in their sequence and association with other signs strongly argue against a coherent script or a consistent meaning," end quote. This interpretation has really served as the dominant model for understanding this corpus. However, over the last several years, I've been kind of reanalyzing it as part of a postdoc that I had on this stamp seals from the Southern Levant project. And I came to the conclusion that I think we need to pay closer attention to it. Why? One of the important observations that Daphna made is that some of these signs don't appear in Egyptian scripts at all. And so I asked, where were these signs seen? Is it possible that they were being seen anywhere else? Can we find them anywhere else? And I'll argue that we can actually find them in the Byblos script. Now, the next several slides are laid out the same. So on the right, you'll have a Middle Bronze scarab from excavated context in the southern Levant. In the center, you see script signs from the Byblos script, and on the far left are the supposed Egyptian sign forms from which the Byblos script signs derive. So these have been proposed by other people, or these middle signs, and these are signs that I am proposing are graphically similar to the ones in the middle. I'm not going to go through each sign, but I'm going to flip through a few examples to highlight the paleographic similarity. So here you see two scarabs from Jericho, with signs that are more paleographically similar to the Byblos script signs than the Byblos script signs are to their supposed Egyptian counterparts. Here we see two signs on scarabs without a proposed origin in the Egyptian scripts, at least a published proposed origin that I can find. The top appears as a decorative motif on Middle Bronze scarabs, often identified as the Egyptian Kenbet sign, terminating at the border of the base. Notably, we actually saw the same sign on the seal of Taweret and the beast with its protruding tongue. Particularly interesting is the sign on the bottom. Again, to my knowledge, no parallel has been proposed in the Egyptian scripts, kind of highlighting this distinction between Southern Levantine scarab producers and the makers of the Byblos script. Here on Jericho 228, we see 5 signs with their closest parallel in the Byblos script. And I should also say, signs in the box, these mean that these signs the stance has been flipped. So when you flip the stance, it becomes much more graphically similar. The images themselves, though, reflect, as you can see, the original stance photographs. 8 signs appear on this scarab from Megiddo, which actually looks to be an actual inscription, just in an unknown script as of yet. And then the last one I'll show is a seal from Lachish, which kind of begins with this loop with a vertical line extending from the top, which is one of the more popular signs in the Byblos script that I cannot find in any other known contemporary scripts. Notably, this seal is really important because most of the signs are found in the Byblos script, which begs the question, have we actually overlooked this corpus of pseudo-hieroglyphic stamp seals from the Southern Levant from excavated Middle Bronze contexts to begin anchoring the date of the Byblos script and its development? Now, these parallels aren't restricted to signs, but also the design of seals. So here we see the same arrangement of signs in vertical columns with double line dividers on a stela from Byblos, as on scarabs from Middle Bronze Age context. We also see the same outlining of signs like on some stone stela from Byblos, and signs that we know are unattested in the Egyptian scripts appearing in the Byblos script and on locally produced seals from the Southern Levant, highlighting the design-related practices connecting these two data sets. So from a practice point of view, it appears that the same community is utilizing these signs in graphically similar ways. I shouldn't say the same community. It seems like geographically distinct communities are utilizing these signs in the same way. So to recap, I just compared specific signs on Middle Bronze Age scarabs from excavated contexts in the Southern Levant with proposed corresponding signs in the Byblos script, and the supposed Egyptian scripts from which they derive. And basically, paleographically, they look very similar. So I think we might have overlooked this corpus, and we might be looking at a corpus that can help us anchor the development of the Byblos script through data that's actually coming from excavated contexts external to the site. So to offer some concluding thoughts, I'm going to skip through these. These are just some additional motifs that are shared, material concerns shared together. You have the same kind of tools being used across communities, same techniques. Now some concluding thoughts. When we pull together different regional threads, we weave a much more complicated picture than currently exists, one that raises new questions about the nature of contact between communities and the graphic worlds in which they inhabited and shared. Many of these scripts appear to develop alongside a trans-regional trade in textiles, metals, semi-precious stones. And alongside this, we see the sharing of motifs and the development of ecliptic Koine. We can also map the movement of craftspeople as well as shared ways of body adornment and potentially amuletic practice. And ask how through cooperation, such shared repertoires were constantly being renegotiated as these scripts developed. However, as I stated in the beginning, these are just some preliminary observations to kind of complicate the picture and think about how best to expand our approaches to the study of script design during the Middle Bronze Age in the East Mediterranean. We need a systematic investigation. This is ongoing, but I think through a community of practice approach, we might help to nuance our understanding of the various factors impacting on their design. So thank you.